the cult is a major piece really throughout the movement. And then when communism comes in, there are elements of it that are more atheistic. But I think more recently, the occult is also in the second wave in particular has come back with full force. And of course, today there are more women practicing Wicca in the United States than Presbyterianism, which is a major denomination here in the US.
We're here to talk about your latest book on feminism. I want to ask, first of all, what is wrong with feminism today?
Yeah, well, I think, we've gone to the point, obviously, where we can't define what a woman is anymore. And so I think that's probably the first problem. We also are seeing, obviously, the trans movement where women are trying to become not women and, vice versa. And I think we're also facing a huge, tremendous birth dearth in the world, in Western countries. And that's, creating all kinds of problems, immigration issue and beyond. So I think there's some major cracks happening on a civilizational level. And most of them are as a result of feminism, I think.
I know that you talk about the history of feminism in your book. Can you give us a bit of an idea of where feminism comes from, where it starts throughout history?
So it actually starts in your country with Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792. She's long been considered the grandmother of feminism with her vindication of the rights of women. And it goes through, it jumps back to the United States with women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are, household names in the United States because they were generally involved in the suffrage movement. And then it proceeds to sort of go more back to Europe. We've got Simone de Beauvoir, who's really marks the end of the first wave of feminism. So that's the first wave. And then the second wave happens with Betty Friedan and the publication of her book, The Feminine Mystique. And that was in 1963. And at that point, you really see this integration of Marxist concepts involved in the second wave. And that's really where, abortion is legalized, and you have the dramatic shift in the understanding of woman, where woman becomes kind of a victim and men become the victimizers. And that actually is built into the ideology. And then you move on to the third and the fourth wave, which involved intersectionality. And then, of course, the trans movement. So it's had a long history, but I think the roots of it really, and the footprint of it really started in the first wave. And I think that's something that very few people know, is how the ideas for the second, third, and fourth wave were already there in the first wave.
So the root of all this is about women being oppressed by the so-called patriarchy. And this is something that we're told constantly when we're growing up. This is just this is just the mainstream view now across the West. Do you disagree with that premise that women have historically been oppressed by men, and that feminism's goals of liberating women from this oppression is worthy?
Yeah, no, I think that really that what's happened was, and again, this goes back to Mary Wollstonecraft, where she's against any kind of hierarchy. She really wants to see women, in many respects, just become like men. And that's one of the things that starts early on. And some of it has to do with the fact that the home is denigrated at that stage. It had been really the locus of activity. And then the Industrial Revolution happens. And so the home becomes, everything that used to happen in the home got pushed out into the world. And so women's role really became denigrated. And rather than saying, how do we help women feel a sense of purpose again because we've changed the home, the feminist answer was, how do we make women more like men? And Wollstonecraft is the forerunner of that, and we just see it get tighter and tighter in that model. But there has to be an enemy, and that is the patriarchy. And this is really what the women in the United States were doing, was trying to undermine Christianity, because they were saying that men were using Christianity to oppress men. So certainly there were things that we could say that women suffered from and struggled with, but most of them have not been solved by the feminist movement. Certainly the vote didn't solve them, because a lot of them were emotional issues, abuse. The only way to solve some of these pieces is really to have greater, an increase in Christianity instead of its opposite. So feminism, rather than solving the issue, actually just sort of has sealed women off from relationships, from children, from husbands. And the idea is really to focus on our autonomy and to not really allow ourselves to be vulnerable in any way. And also to really be mimicking the ways in which men, and not good men, live in the world and are focused on career instead of on, understanding their fertility as a really important part of their life. So I would disagree with the premise, I think. And of course, all of this just got worse in the 1960s and 70s because of the critical theory edition, where women became the victims, men were the victimizers, even though, individuals may not have been in any way involved in either of those things. It just became a classification for being. So, yeah, I would disagree with the premise. I think that there's, it's very hard to judge what was going on in the 1700s, 1800s, and who was suffering what, because everybody was suffering. This is a really, compared to the world in which we live today. So it's easy to look back and say how awful things were. But in effect, we haven't actually solved the issues that they were trying to solve. In fact, we've made them worse. Women are not happier now under feminism than they were prior to feminism's arrival, especially in the second wave.
There's this conception of women's roles in families and in society before feminism as being one of oppression again, not being able to earn their own money, being dependent on the man, being forced to bring up the children whilst the man is doing the work, and not being able to make decisions about their own lives, and also not being in positions of power in society, in the elites and so on. How do you respond to that conception of the world before feminism, where women were just these kind of meek people who were forced to have kids and look after the kids and had no say in anything at all?
Yeah. Well, what's really interesting, and I go into this in the book, is to see what's happening in England. And women, in many respects, were treated like property. And obviously, I'm not defending that. But I think we also have to look at the uniqueness of that time. Many of those ideas actually came from David Hume and the privatization of property. So I think that to sort of just take this, understand this belief that all women were oppressed and that all these things that they did were drudgery and they were really just being abused or enslaved by men, I think doesn't really bear witness to that. I have also in my book, I talk about a woman named Hannah More, who was actually lived right before Mary Wollstonecraft. They were contemporaries for a short time. Hannah lived much longer than Wollstonecraft did. Was much more popular. And she thought at the time, here's a woman that's writing at the same time as Wollstonecraft. She actually refused to read her work because she said, why would I want to be an imitation of a man instead of the best woman that I could be? So I think underlying that criticism or critique that you just raised is this idea that power is better, that raising children is just drudgery, that it's a terrible plight to be at home with your children, and I think all of that is really part of the narrative that we've been sold, that somehow these are awful realities, and unless we escape them, we're not going to be happier or fulfilled. But ironically, we have seen while women have left the home, they haven't abandoned motherhood. This is why we're seeing that just this radical increase in pet parents and fur babies. And, apparently the next thing is plants, being plant parents. So women have this innate desire to nurture something. That we're made for life. We're made to give life to others. So I think it's a complete disservice to look back at history and say, we've been oppressed. There was no one happy. There were poor relationships between men and women prior to that. Marriages, I think it's just a misread of it. And while certainly there, were laws that I wouldn't agree with, the better thing to do would have been to change the laws instead of to just really throw the baby out with the bathwater and disrupt the whole culture, create all this tension between men and women, and really disorder women in a way that hasn't served them at all through this period.
I'm a great lover of history and I've read loads of biographies, and the wives always seem to have a huge influence on their husbands, or even in the politics and things like that. It wasn't that just women had no agency or had no influence whatsoever. And particularly in the 18th century, where you're talking about where feminism begins, I can think of lots of different women who had lots of power in Europe, in England. You had Emma Hamilton, the wife of, or the kind of what's the right word, the mistress of Lord Nelson in England, who was one of Europe's most famous figures. You had Marie Antoinette, of course. You even had queens of England. Queen Elizabeth, lots of the first people say is the greatest queen of England, or even monarch of England. And you had her sister, Queen Mary, as well. So it's not like women have been completely sidelined throughout history and have no agency at all. Do you agree with that? Do you see lots of women throughout history that kind of bucks the narrative of feminism?
No, I'm so glad you brought that point up, because I think that's really the key is if you're trying to make women have a certain kind of power, then it's very difficult to say that women are the same as men. But women weren't made to be the same as men. And I think you're exactly right. There's significant influence, even just in raising children. I have 5 children, and I can really see what the way in which I can steer them for good or for ill. But we certainly have seen the same thing in the United States. Women like Abigail Adams, who was hugely influential on President John Adams. Edith Roosevelt is another one who I've been reading about recently. Just so many remarkable women, and the role that they played that was certainly more subtle and less flashy, but was really instrumental. Martha Washington is another one that comes to mind, George Washington's wife. So yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make, is if we're looking for a specific kind of power and control, which is what feminism really is about, then it's hard to match them one to one. But if we're actually looking at influence, at giving life, at really helping people become who it is that they're meant to be, that women have that capacity, because we can see subtleties and be dialed into people in the way that men naturally aren't. Not that they can't do it, but it's really a gift that women have. And so I think it's a matter of really figuring out what it is that women do and where their gifts are and the ways in which they're meant to be used, instead of just constantly be worrying about accolades or power or control.
I will stick with this theme of the history in a moment, but I do want to ask, you mentioned this idea that women today, they still want to have babies, but in a different way. So like they might be obsessed with their cat. That was one of the examples that you brought up. I saw this meme recently, or this viral thing going around, that lots of women say that having a boyfriend is cringe. I don't know if you saw this. What did you make of this? Yeah, this new idea that just even having a partner, a male partner as a woman, is somehow embarrassing for women.
Yeah, there's a new word for it. I just read it the other day. What is it? It's like man tending. That's what it is, I think. Is this idea that, I think this is a natural result of it. We've told women that they're meant to be autonomous. That's really the idol that feminism is worshiping, is independence and autonomy. And we also have created women who are not necessarily the great at relationships. One of the things that has been really interesting historically is to look at the ways in which women have been politically manipulated so that they're actually angry. The socialists in 1890 in the United States realized that if you make women angry, they are going to be more politically expedient than if they're not angry. So we see this with the idea of consciousness raising that was really prolific around the time of the 1960s and 70s. Most people like Kate Millett were involved in it. And they said they thought it actually came from China, but China actually got it from the United States. It was used in Maoist China. So as a result of this, we've got women who have been told that not only are they supposed to be autonomous, but they're also meant to have contempt for men. They're also generally, often involved in the occult, and they're often promiscuous. And none of those things are elements that are going to actually lead to female happiness and allow women to be vulnerable in a relationship in a way that's healthy and, really can stand the test of time and struggles. So it shouldn't surprise us that women have gone to the point where they're like, well, let's get rid of this altogether. And I think we're seeing the same thing among men, where they just don't want to be bothered with it, because relationships have become so hard and so challenging because of the way in which we've been told that we need to behave.
Okay, you mentioned the occult. I think this is fascinating. Can you tell us about feminism's connection with the occult?
Yeah. So this actually started with Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was Mary Wollstonecraft's son-in-law. They actually never met because she died giving birth to Mary Shelley. But he was fascinated by Mary's work, and he was also fascinated by William Godwin's work. And William Godwin was the biggest promoter of the end of monogamy. He thought that it was a kind of slavery for women. So Shelley takes those two ideas, and then he adds a third, which is this idea of the occult. He was fascinated by it himself. He slept in a coffin one night so that he could connect with the devil. I mean, it was something that he was very involved in. And he writes a poem about this woman named Sithna, and she has all three of those things: the contempt for men, then the promiscuity, and the occult. And so it's really interesting to see those three things together, because if you look at most, especially women in college today, most of them are involved in all three of those elements. But Shelley didn't stop there. He knew that there was really what had to happen was a rewriting of Genesis. And he promoted this idea using Paradise Lost of how do we rewrite Genesis so that Eve is a heroine, and she ends up getting some knowledge from the serpent. And these ideas really took hold. And so when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was a suffragette in the United States, got interested in the women's movement, she became very involved in not only this idea about Eve, but also trying to eliminate the Bible, because she believed it was the way in which women were enslaved. But she was also involved in what was called spiritualism. And this was a movement going on, particularly in New York State, where people would sit around a table and invite spirits in, basically like a seance, I think, and ask questions, and the spirit would knock supposedly at the table. And so this is where she got the idea for the Seneca Falls conference that she hosted. And this table is actually in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. today. So all of that. And this is far from the only people that were involved in the occult. There was another woman who gets very little credit, but she was involved in the feminist movement, the women's movement, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and her name was Matilda Gage. And she was the mother-in-law of L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz. She was very much a promoter of witchcraft. And you can see that in The Wizard of Oz, because she believed in the idea of good witches and bad witches, and of course that's the embodiment of the Wizard of Oz, but also this turning of the patriarchy on its head, where Baum writes about the wizard who ends up just being, an old frail man behind a curtain. And that was really so much of his mother-in-law's influence. So anyway, it's that the cult is a major piece really throughout the movement. And then when communism comes in, there are elements of it that are more atheistic. But I think more recently, the occult is also, in the second wave in particular, has come back with full force. And of course, today there are more women practicing Wicca in the United States than Presbyterianism, which is a major denomination here in the US.
That's fascinating. I did know that witchcraft is a thing here in the US, I suppose in Britain as well, to an extent. And it does seem to impact women, you're right, more than men, and a very particular type of woman. And you mentioned The Wizard of Oz. It's fascinating because this film, Wicked, has just come out, Wicked Part 2. And that tries to kind of throw the Wizard of Oz's story on its own head, saying the kind of evil witch or the wicked witch was actually a good person or something. I don't know.
Yeah, so I haven't seen it either. Yeah.
Is Wicked also, I guess, part of this occult feminist message, do you think? Do you see a lot of this stuff in the pop culture today with things like Wicked and other movies and TV shows?
No, I think absolutely. Even the movie Barbie was really amazing. It was incredibly feminist movie, but I think feminism has had this capacity to sort of rebrand itself over the years and make it attractive to different generations. So, when I was growing up, to imagine Barbie as a feminist was really laughable, because this was, nobody wanted, like I didn't even admit till I was probably in my 20s that I liked the color pink, because you just weren't supposed to like anything feminine back in the 70s and 80s. And so the fact that it then comes out as Barbie, which is all pink, it's about dolls, Ken is still just this whipping boy and just ridiculous. I think that was an effort to really rebrand feminism. And so Wicked feels like it's another effort at that. And it's, even more sinister because of the fact that it's involved so much of the occult. I went to the mall recently with one of my daughters, and I was just amazed at how much witchcraft content there was in places like Barnes and Noble, and also just in regular stores because of the influence of that film. So it seems like that as a movement, it just continues to sort of ratchet it up and bring, influence people in ways they don't even realize they're being influenced by the occult, and kind of absorbing it and normalizing it in the culture.
I know you talk a lot about Christianity as well, and Christianity's relationship with feminism. Does feminism try and mimic Christianity in some way? And why are so many Christians also feminists?
Yeah, those are two great questions, and very separate. But the first one, I finally had the realization after studying feminism enough that feminism actually has established a shadow church. It's got this idol, which we've talked about already, this idea of autonomy. That's really the goal, and everything else is meant to be in service to that.
So the self is kind of like God. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah, the highest priority, and everything else exactly is meant to be focused on that. There's also the type of commandments. Those are what I mentioned already: the promiscuity, contempt for men, and the occult. There, it has its own kind of theological virtues. So Christianity has faith, hope, and love. Feminism has anger, contempt, and envy. It has its own form of evangelization, which is, part of that is broken women break other people. And so it's very easy to pass feminism on in the generations and around other women, and certainly men for that matter as well. And it's even got its own sacrament, which is the idea of abortion, because you cannot be an autonomous woman if you don't have access, and promiscuous if you do not have access to abortion. So it's all of those pieces that really have come together, and I think this is one of the reasons why feminism is really hard to get away from, is because it's like an integrated whole. Because it answers the questions: how do I behave? How do I think? How do I feel? What do I focus on? And it's affected so many women. But now to your other question about how it's connected to Christianity, a lot of women, I think, because of the power and the magnetism that feminism has in our culture, because it really feels like the only show in town. I get the question all the time, like, how am I supposed to act if I'm not a feminist? How do I understand and conceptualize womanhood without feminism? So because of this, I think there are a lot of Christian women who are trying to not only rebrand feminism so that it's more palatable to Christianity, but they're also trying to, create a bridge between what they think Christians are and what non-Christian feminists are, and try to bring the non-Christian feminists into Christianity, if that makes sense. So in light of that there all kinds of efforts have been made to really make it more palatable to those who are deeply in radical feminism, by saying, oh, we're like you, come join us. The problem is it hasn't had that effect among Christian women. And in fact, you see women, especially among Protestants, who are very involved in feminism. Many of them get involved in the occult or in paganism. I talk about that a great deal in the book. And then with the issue of Catholicism, there's been this effort to try to make Catholicism compatible, especially with first wave feminism, by trying to make Mary Wollstonecraft some sort of disciple of Thomas Aquinas, which is clearly a stretch in light of the fact that she was very much involved in the French Revolution with the men like William Godwin, Thomas Paine, Dr. Richard Price, all of those men who considered themselves revolutionary men. And she herself was a promoter of the French Revolution, which is deeply anti-Catholic. So in any event, there's this, lot of threads of incompatibility. And I think we've had enough years, Christian women have been trying this for decades, 3 at least, and it hasn't really borne a lot of fruit. So I think we have to start asking ourselves, what will work? And we're really at a stage where Christianity actually has a kind of appeal that it hasn't had over the last 5 decades. And so I think, living a robust Christian life is a lot more attractive than trying to water down the faith to be more palatable to those who might not be interested in it.
Let's talk about abortion. This has had a huge impact on American electoral politics over the last few decades, really since the 1970s and Roe versus Wade. Why is abortion so important to particularly young women today? I mean, if I speak to the majority of women, just in my life living in Washington, D.C., almost all of them would be supportive of abortion. And not only would they be supportive of it, they would be incredibly emotional, angry, defensive, that you're taking away, or you want to take away, their right to healthcare. That's how they see it. That this is about women's rights, a women's right to choose. And, this really, it makes them so upset that they wouldn't have access to that. So can you just break that down?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question because it is a huge electoral issue. The reason is because of the role of autonomy, and women have been told that they're going to be most fulfilled in a career. And the only way in which they can compete with men is if they are not pregnant and having children. And that's the real crux of it. If you've been told your whole life that motherhood is not important, that it doesn't play a role in your life, and that you really need to focus on your career and your earning and the status that you have, then absolutely it looks like a total obstacle, and abortion must exist under the feminist ideology in order for women to be fulfilled in that way. Now, of course, the problem is that we're seeing that this, hasn't actually fulfilled women, and it's turned out to be a kind of scapegoating. I mean, this is the real tragedy: is that we have all these abortions taking place, and they're not strangers killing each other. This is actually mothers killing their own children, fathers killing their own children, grandparents. It's very much within the family, and this is the irony: is that feminism has led us to believe that our happiness in the way that we can help the world is going to happen out there, far away from us, and people we may not know, that's really where our influence is going to be. And Jordan Peterson calls this misplaced compassion. Allie Beth Stuckey just came out with a book called Toxic Empathy. And this is really one of the problems that has been perpetuated through feminism, is this idea that we can still be effective because we feel strongly about something, and this is really where the emotions come in and get stirred up. Is that effort has been very successful, but the reality is that women are most successful and most important in a local setting. Those things that are closest to her is where she's fundamentally meant to make her influence. And then when she does that well, then she can go broader, or do bigger. If you look at someone even like Mother Teresa, who was a spiritual mother, because motherhood isn't just meant to be biological, it's meant to be spiritual and emotional, psychological, mentoring. But she, this is a woman that had this calling to go to India to just help people die well. And now has this whole ministry, that's lived on well past her, where people are being helped, children are being helped, the poor, the dying, all over the world because of her vision. But it has to start on a local level with real people. And this is really where women have their best gifts can play out. And I think that's one of the lies that we have bought in deeply, is that our children aren't important, but helping those, maybe in foreign countries that we'll never meet, are important. And it's, that's the tragedy is those are the people we may never meet, and they don't make demands on us. So it's a very easy kind of charity when you don't have to go home and, you can do whatever you want and not really tend and give of yourself to others. But that's also really where the reward and the fruit is being able to give yourself to others and, give them life and help them become better people. And additionally, I will add one more thing, is just to say too, the problem that we're seeing is that women then, when they do have children, they're having a really hard time feeling empathy for their children. And much of this is just because of the generational, I guess you would call it abuse, or even kind of neglect that's happened to children, where they didn't have the right attachment with their own mothers, their own parents. And so they don't, they grow up and then they don't have the capacity to be able to do that in their own life. So we can see the generational effects of this. There's a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists who are talking about it. The cluster B personality traits are also connected with this lack of affirmation in children. So it's interesting to just see the tentacles of this, that it's not just in voting that it creates problems, but it's also mental health issues and just societal wide issues in terms of the birth dearth and whatnot.
Irina, the Ukrainian girl in Charlotte, a few months ago, where she was brutally stabbed to death by a man who had lots and lots of previous charges, again, released on bail, by a female judge. Now, maybe I'm being harsh saying female judge there. What do you make of feminism's impact on the judicial system, on crimes like this? Is there any link, or is that something I'm just making up?
No, there's a huge link. I mean, we would not have gotten to DEI, to this woke culture, if feminism hadn't been successful first. Feminism is sort of like the trial balloon. And if you can make women victims, even though they've never been victimized, you can make anybody a victim. Even someone who's been arrested 72 times, that he's looked at as a victim and needs to be let go. So that's really where the ideology started. Woke ideology came from feminism, and feminism came from communism. So yeah, I think that's there is a real connection, and because women have been so indoctrinated in this, and it goes back to this idea too that if I just, if I have enough compassion, something good will come out of it. It's really driven by the emotions, and also now, of course, the DEI posturing has a lot to do with it as well. But much of it is driven by this victimhood mentality. And it's even, I talk about this in the book, it's even interesting to look at how, because we've gotten rid of Christianity as a cultural influence, people don't have things like the Ten Commandments to really help them understand how it is that they ought to live their lives, or basic Christian principles. And so instead, people are really at the whims of whoever the latest victim is. And we've put victims on such a pedestal. And so you can see, well, what flag should I be flying today? So that I look, I'm virtue signaling to others to show them that I'm a good person because I know who the right victim is. And that's, I think, a huge problem societally, but absolutely it comes because feminism has been so successful at making women victims and, allowing them the space to behave and act in these ways that are not just irrational, but actually incredibly damaging, certainly to those two women, tragically destroyed their lives. And, there's no changing that. We can't go back, and it keeps continuing to happen. So yes, feminism is really at the root of all that.
There's also a huge gender divide politically between men and women in terms of who they vote for. So women are far more likely to vote Democrat, men more likely to vote Republican, and it's particularly single women who are more likely to vote Democrat, and married women are more likely to vote Republican. So it's really single women driving a lot of this stuff, and they seem to be voting for Democrats who support the kind of policies on crime, on justice, that perhaps led to or leads to some of these attacks on women themselves. And we saw in Britain over the last few decades, it's still actually ongoing, this terrible, terrible crime, mostly against women, some boys were impacted, of the rape gang scandal. And feminists didn't seem to focus particularly, or even at all, I'd say, maybe some did, but it wasn't really a huge campaign for feminists in Britain for the victims of the rape gang scandal, where Pakistani men largely were abusing and raping children and young women in Britain. Do you see a kind of hypocrisy in feminism today where there seems to be empathy for some women or for some people and not empathy for others, or sympathy or campaigning for others? Is there kind of a bit of hypocrisy going on there?
Well, I think it appears to be hypocrisy until you really understand what's driving them. And of course, it comes back to that idea of victimhood, and the Pakistani men, in their opinion and their indoctrination, really are the victims, and children, again, are sort of throwawayable. They're not important. We don't need to be so concerned with them. So that is really the mindset of the feminist world has portrayed and perpetuated. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that they're not the ones that are out saying, we need to protect our girls. It was the same thing with the trans men or trans women rather in sports, men playing female sports. The feminists were largely not a voice in that, except with the exception of someone like J.K. Rowling. But for the most part, women were really vilified if they came out in support of keeping men out of women's sports. So over and over again, you just have to figure out where their priority is in terms of who the victims are, and then things make their own sense internally. But the tragedy is, of course, is that it's the innocent who are generally being abused, mistreated, and, obviously even killed on so many, in so many different ways in the culture today. But what's interesting is I think also we're seeing, because of this violence, the increase in violence, um, we're going to start seeing a lot more efforts at security for women. I know in Washington D.C., I lived there for years, and I never felt unsafe in Washington. And now when I'm in the city, I don't feel safe. I'm a lot more conscientious about my surroundings. I think those kinds of things are actually going to be a reflection and kind of, in a certain respect, even a helpful corrective to understanding the role and importance of men in our lives and what it is that they do for us. I had that sense of security in Washington, D.C., because there was good police, because people, knew that women felt protected and safe. But when that diminishes, then we really get back to a place where we have to start thinking about how do we protect women. And I think that's where we're going to start seeing men. And we see it in natural disasters as well. I think the men are the one that show up in terms of really helping in crisis situations. And the more we can see that, I think we need just modeling of what good men are, but we also need to start modeling better what good women are. And that's really not what's happening on a wide scale yet.
So it's clear that your message is failing to appeal to women, and particularly young women, because I'm sure you'd admit this, most of them are feminists, most of them vote Democrat, as I said, most of them support, abortion and so on. What is your message to young women today? Because I feel that Republicans and anti-feminist types seem to be like they're attacking women almost, because they hold these views. Oh, you're stupid, you're ignorant, you're emotional, whatever it is. And that's not a very appealing message. I know that you're not doing that, but what would you say to young women today who, for example, let's say that I'm a young woman and I like my job, I like having a career. Maybe I probably do want children one day, but I don't want to give everything up. What do I do? And what's your message to those people who say, I don't want to just be this trad wife type person who's just looking after the kids my whole life. I have more ambitions than that.
Right. Well, I would say several things. The first thing I'm seeing a ton of, I started writing and talking about this topic 10 years ago, and nobody was talking about it. And now it's gained steam significantly in the last certainly 2 or 3 years since I wrote my book, The End of Woman, that came out in 2023. Even between that book and this book's release, it's amazing how much more how many more conversations we're having. The thing I would say to women is that we've been told I think we've been lied to. I feel a tremendous amount of compassion to women. I know that feminism was hugely influential in my own life, and I think I have had and continue to do a lot to really restore who it is that I'm meant to be, and not fit into that feminist mold or fall into that. I think that's the important thing, is that women need to understand they're meant to be women. They're not meant to mimic men. And this is what the culture has told us. So if we can get back to what that actually means, and part of that is really understanding the role of motherhood, and not just biological motherhood. I think this is something that, I have small children. When they were small, they played with dolls. My boys weren't interested in dolls. I mean, this isn't something I pushed upon them. It's because we're interested in nurturing others and caring for others. So the more that young women can actually recognize that as a part of themselves, instead of really taking on the masculine ethos, you see this in law firms, you see it in law schools, you see it in, I studied my PhDs in philosophy, so there are very few women in philosophy. In all the professions, women are generally absorbing a very masculine kind of culture. And that's okay for a time being. You have to fit in. But at a certain point, a woman has to get back to a place where she matures sufficiently that her maternal gifts appear, and she becomes really a mature woman. And part of that means looking out for the needs of others, caring for others, being thoughtful. And, so I would say, I'm not suggesting that women give up their careers. I clearly work. But my suggestion is that you need to figure out who you are as a woman, instead of as a woman who's trying to copy men in order to get ahead. There are things that are obviously so much more important. I meet women almost every week who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they just feel cheated because they bought into the lies, and they pushed off family, they pushed away men, they didn't have children, and then they wonder, how did I get to this place? This isn't what I expected my life to look like when I was at this stage in life. So I think that that's a really great way for young women to start. Well, what do you want your life to look like when you are older? Most will not say, most won't say, I want to be alone. I don't want to have children or have had a husband or any kind of family. Most will have a much more rich, relationally rich image in mind. So it's important for women to really figure that out as young women, instead of just buying into whatever is trendy and the model is, but really figure out who it is that they've been made to be, and develop that and allow those pieces to grow in their lives.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate that. That was a great interview.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.